As the technology for television generally was advancing, developing, uh, kind of an offshoot of television generally was the advent and advancement of cable. Cable really started for a couple of reasons. First was it really got its start in less populated areas, particularly rural areas, where there weren't a lot of TV stations, or if there were TV stations, they were several miles away, maybe 10 miles, 20 miles away in a local town. Um, and the only way you could get that signal from a television station is to have a relatively tall antenna come off your house or off your land somewhere, and so that it could capture that signal. It was also an effort by appliance dealers, since this technology was relatively new. Appliance dealers who sold washing machines and dryers and radios and other sorts of electronic devices wanted to sell this new product that was out there that was called television. Uh, but of course, people aren't going to buy television, aren't going to buy television sets if there's nothing to watch on television. So having something that would allow people to watch programming or have programming available, that means that they're actually going to buy televisions to watch that programming. So what was established was what was known as community antenna television, or CATV. What communities did is basically pool resources from their community, from their municipal government, set aside budget for a one-time relatively large investment that would first build a facility, a very large antenna on a really higher part of ground in the community, so that it could get not just one TV station, local TV station, but several TV stations that were maybe 50, 60 miles away. And then that, of course, would cost money, but then they would also have to make it available, meaning that they would have to wire the town so that any of the residents in the town who wanted to pay a subscription to the town could get that programming that would be captured by that community antenna. And then they would pay a subscription and then be a part of that communications technology. What the consumer got out of this was, first, a good steady signal. If you had an antenna on your house or you had an antenna on your property, basically what you did is you had a little dialer that would basically had a lever on it, and you push one side of the lever and it would turn clockwise, or you push the other side of the lever and it would turn counterclockwise. And what you were doing was you were turning the antenna so that it could capture that signal from a particular station in a particular direction. So one might be north, you would turn the antenna so that it's pointing north and capturing that signal. Another station might be west, and so you would turn the antenna to capture that signal. Problem is, you had to really kind of fidget with the lever in order to get the best possible signal. And very often you really didn't. You may have a picture that was snowy or was really kind of unstable, wasn't really clear, and so you would just have to live with that. Some stations were closer, some stations were further away, and the signal, the quality of the signal would depend on how close or how far they were. With cable, you didn't have to worry about that. The channels were right there. You just flipped your switch and the station would show up very clear, very steady signal. And then it also really kind of accomplished what its purpose was, and that is to provide more of a variety of channels to consumers in the town. Again, with your own homemade antenna, you might get 3 channels, depending, of course, on the distance that they are away. But with a community antenna system, they could, with the more advanced technology, be able to lock into maybe 6 or 7 or 8 channels, and then they might even have their own programming that's being generated in the community. So there was a much wider variety of the number of channels through the community cable system that you were going to get, as opposed to having your own antenna. As cable was starting to expand less as a community project, but more as a commercial project, it was limited, very limited, really until the early 70s. And there were primarily 2 reasons for that. First, it was a major capital investment. If you wanted to start a cable company, you had to have a lot of money in order to do that, or you had to borrow a lot of money in order to do that. What cable companies would do is they would come into a community, or a community would approach the cable system, and they would negotiate. The community and the cable company would negotiate what's called a franchise. And this is basically a monopoly for the cable system that granted this monopoly to the cable system from the community, and but then the cable system would provide certain specific services for this exclusive franchise. What the cable company would do is they would come in, they would wire the town, they would build a technical facility, just like with the community type of cable. And then as customers would subscribe to it, they would bring the wire to each individual home, set up that home with a converter for the signal, or a signal into their television sets. Then the programming would come to that technical facility via satellite, for the most part, eventually by satellite. In the beginning years, it was through phone wires. And then that programming would flow to the customers in their homes. And then if there were any problems, the cable company would provide maintenance. They would provide service for repairs or upgrades of technology, things like that. So, and again, this is for the cable company. This is a significant capital investment. They're paying for all of this stuff to be done to a community. But then what the cable company got out of this from the community was a 15-year, usually a 15-year exclusive franchise. No other cable company could come into this community and make a contract with the community for 15 years. That meant that basically the cable company had carte blanche. They could do pretty much whatever they wanted that wasn't in the contract. That meant that if this cable company and a lot of new cable companies were in it just to make the money, the cable companies and the communities were in a binding contract. So if the cable companies didn't live up to the contract, the communities, that's just too bad. If it wasn't, I mean, I guess as a community, and again, this is new technologies, communities don't know what to look for when they're when they're entering into contracts with these cable companies, because this is something new. And so very often cable companies would put in very loose language, very flexible language that didn't say that they had to do specific things, and consequently, if their service was bad, if they wanted to raise prices, they could pretty much do what they wanted, and there wasn't much that communities could do about that. The second reason that there was limited availability of cable systems was that they were competing with local broadcasters. In other words, these commercial TV stations that are around the area. And what cable companies were doing was bringing in programming from more distant places. So local broadcasters feared that the importation of this programming that they had no control over could eventually put them out of business, or definitely was competing with them. So importation is basically signals from distant TV stations or distant TV channels, TV networks, that are being brought into a community that is competing with and could potentially eliminate local broadcast TV stations. Examples of this might be in our market here in Eau Claire. WKBT is the CBS affiliate, WQOW is the ABC affiliate, and WEAU is the NBC affiliate. And all of these channels come in pretty clearly over the broadcast air in the Eau Claire La Crosse area. But cable systems would go to Minneapolis and get the network affiliates there and import their signals into the cable system here in Eau Claire. That meant that WKBT and La Crosse had to compete against WCCO, the CBS affiliate in Minneapolis, St. Paul. KSTP is the ABC affiliate, and KARE or KARE 11 is the NBC affiliate. So those imported signals were now competing against the local signals from local broadcast TV stations. In order to rectify this, in 1972, the FCC adopted what was called a must-carry rule. That is that cable systems, if there are local stations within the system's area, then the cable system must carry the local TV stations if they want to carry the imported TV stations. And they must pay the local TV stations revenue for use of that signal. Of course, the potential problem here is that it's a kind of a double whammy on the cable system. Not only must they carry the local stations, but they have to pay for it as well. This led to an easing of the must-carry rule in 1992, saying that, okay, if a cable system carries the local TV stations, they don't have to pay a fee. If they don't carry the local TV stations, then they have to pay the local TV stations a particular fee. This means primarily this is incentive for the cable systems to carry the local TV stations, because then they don't have to pay a fee, and they really don't care whether there's competition between the local TV stations and imported TV stations anyway. Other kinds of rules that are related to cable television and the establishment of cable television. One is what's known as syndicated exclusivity. In order to understand this, you have to understand what syndication is. Syndication is basically taking programs, network programs, that have run on the three broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And once those programs have run their course, in other words, they have been introduced into prime time, they may have been popular, they may have been in prime time for 3 or 4 years, or they've been very popular and been on TV for 10 years, 12 years, some up to 25 years. Once that prime time run is over, the question is, what do you do with this program? You've got, you may have 600 shows that are now just going to sit in a vault somewhere and not make any money. Well, syndicators, what they do is they buy the rights to these programs, and then they offer these once network primetime programs to local stations in local markets. And the local stations have the exclusive rights to airing these programs in that market. Well, the problem here is when a cable system comes in, they may have a program that is being aired by another network somewhere else around the country that they are importing into this particular area. So what's happening here is you have the same programming that's on two different channels in the cable system. And that means one of them a local station and the other one an imported network. So what that means is now, again, the local station has competition for this program in its own local community. What happened was a rule was made related to the syndicated exclusivity, or Syndex, that said if a cable company imports a program into a local cable system where a local channel, a local TV station, already has the exclusive rights to that program, like The Big Bang Theory, TBS has that program on its air that's imported on the cable system, but also Fox 2548, a local station in Eau Claire, has Big Bang Theory as well. If that program is imported by the cable company, the cable operator must cover that program. What does cover mean? It means you just can't put it on. You can put something on in its place, or you just go to black for half an hour while that program is on the cable system. Of course, cable companies don't like this, because then they have to make sure that they have to have the technology that's going to automatically cover this, and that's going to cost them money. Or it just is a difficult thing for cable companies to do. So again, eventually this syndicated exclusivity rule is eased in 1980. And again, instead of having to cover that program, cable operators and the channel that's being imported actually pay the local station a certain amount of money for the number of times that program that's being duplicated is broadcast on that cable system, or cablecast on that system, in competition with the local channel that has the local station that has the exclusive rights in that market. Another rule related to cable has to do with public access channels. Access channels are required spaces on cable system dials. That is, that every cable company, every cable system must have at least 2 public access channels. These channels are open to anybody who wants to go to the cable system and generate a program and put that program on the cable system. Usually the public access, there are people who work for the cable company that are there to help citizens put on their own programs. A lot of people who work at the public access channel are volunteers. because they don't have a lot of money. They do have some facilities, but anybody who wants to come, maybe they want to do a program about woodworking or cooking or fixer-uppers or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Pretty much all programming is acceptable. They can make that program, and then it airs on the public access channel. The other channel has to be dedicated to local government. Okay, it has to have educational purposes. So a city council, a county board, a school board, any sort of public municipal government has to be covered by the cable company and their public access channel. How many channels are required? It depends on the market. Smaller markets with cable channels, with a cable system, the requirement is at least 2. If you are in larger markets, there can be as many cable access channels as are needed. There may be, so a larger market like Chicago may have 10 or 15 for each cable system that is in Chicago. Each will have a certain number of public access channels. And again, they're open to the public for anybody to use for any sort of programming. What that meant is some of the programming could be controversial in larger markets like Los Angeles and New York. Some of the programming on access channels had to do with sex, had to do with pornography, the discussion of and really just kind of anything related to sex, which some would consider unacceptable. But also groups that we would consider hate groups nowadays could have their own programming and perpetuate their doctrines of separation or superiority of one group over another, and potentially call for violence. And so these can be, but the rule says, the law says that these people have to be allowed to air their or cable cast their programs, because it is open to anyone, no matter what sort of topic, no matter how controversial that topic might be. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, we've already talked about this a little bit with respect to radio and the issues related to radio. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 is very important with respect to cable and telephone communications, because as the technology was advancing, things that were appearing on television, things that were being brought to consumers via the cable systems, but also via telephone communications. Those technologies were advancing and to a certain extent were interchangeable. So what was happening is cable companies wanted to start providing telephone services to their customers, and phone companies were wanting to provide cable television service to their customers. The idea here was that if you have cable companies that are providing phone service, that provides competition for phone service, and therefore lower prices are going to be provided to the consumer. Vice versa, if the phone companies are providing cable services, that's going to bring prices down because of the competition, and the consumers are going to be happy with that. What this did is led to a number of mergers between very large companies. AT&T, of course, is the phone service that eventually, the company that got out of radio and really kind of focused primarily on telephone communication and telephone service. They merged with the largest cable company of the time in the 1980s, TCI Cable. TCI was in hundreds, thousands of communities around the country. So a merger here meant that the two would basically share the technology, the phone service to TCI and the cable service to AT&T. Another big merger was Time Warner. Time Warner really was getting into the cable systems technology relatively late. And a new kid on the block with internet service, AOL. Um, these two merged again with the idea that AOL would provide internet service with Time Warner, and then Time Warner would provide cable programming over the internet through AOL, all of which would lead to lower prices for consumers. So the expectation of all of this mergers, all of these mergers and all of this melding of different communication technologies, the expectation was that it would bring competition, which would lead to lower prices for the consumers. But it would also provide more outlets for more diverse content, meaning more people would have access to this technology. And so we would see from different groups of people, different minority groups, just different topics. There wouldn't be the same tired sort of entertainment and ideas that had really been a part of television for its first 30 years or so. And to a certain extent, there was some evidence that it was working. Where there was no competition in markets, or where there was exclusivity in markets, the average cable price was about $31, nearly $32 per household. Or per month. Where there were competitive markets, it was around $30. So even though the differences were small, there were differences. This was also a time when that CATV model was starting to emerge a little bit as well. Several communities, instead of inviting cable companies into their communities, would rather start their own, again, doing the same model of building their own antennas, building their own facilities, wiring the communities themselves. And what turned out to be the most economical cable model, with an average price for consumers of $22 a month. But where there were expectations, eventually there were criticisms. These ideas of lower prices, competition, and diverse content just didn't come to fruition. What was found was that cable prices, instead of being lowered, were basically increasing. Since 1996 up into about 2008, the price of cable went up 77%. What cable operators were arguing is that this was the reason for this increase in pricing was because of the higher cost of programming. There were more programs. That meant that they had to buy more programs. That cost of that programming was going up, and the technology for transmitting that programming was going up. So they, as cable companies, had to pay more, and so of course they were going to pass that increase on to their customers. But where there was a lot of criticism is that as a subscriber to a cable company, you are paying for a lot of channels that you just don't use. A study by Nielsen found in 2001 that if you had, on average, a contract for 15 channels, anywhere between 11 and 20 channels, you actually only watched 5 of those channels on a regular basis, which is 33% of the channels you're paying for. In a system where you had anywhere from 91 to 100 channels, you were actually watching 15 of those channels on a regular basis, which is only 15%. And the big one here is if you are in a system where you're getting more than 120 channels, an average of 195 channels, you're actually only watching 18 of those channels on a regular basis, which is less than 1% of the channels, yet you're paying for all of them. What the cable companies argued, of course, is that for them, and this is true, they don't just buy channels. They don't buy one channel at a time. They have to buy a package of channels. So if they want ESPN on their cable system, they can't just buy ESPN. They have to have ESPN, they have to have ESPN2, they have to have ESPN University, they have to have ESPN Classic, they have to have ESPN Hispanic. They have to have them all. So even though you as a consumer may only be watching ESPN, you still have to pay for all 5 or 10 of their channels, because that's what the cable system has to pay for. And this isn't just ESPN. A lot of the channels are owned as, 5 or 6 channels may be owned by one company. So if you want one of those channels that's very popular, you have to pay for all, or the cable company has to pay for all of them. And of course, they're going to pass that expense on to the customer. The second criticism is that even though with all of this putting together, allowing different technologies to intermingle and really kind of meld together, that there was going to be competition, there really was no competition. In a study by the Consumer Federation in 2002, basically what was found is that 95% of the households in the United States that had cable were in non-competitive cable communities, meaning you had to take whatever was available. If you wanted cable, you got whatever was in your town, and that was it. Simply because they were still operating under those exclusive franchises. So the idea that the 1996 Telecommunications Act and its rules were going to increase competition just didn't become reality. Where this has actually changed and has had a significant effect is with the internet. Services like Hulu and Netflix and YouTube, and now more and more streaming services, this has become the real competition for cable systems and satellite systems. It's also the fact that with the younger generation being more comfortable with technology, more mobile technology like cell phones and tablets, this is the type of service that they're going to, and they don't really have cable or or satellite services. Rather, they're bringing it into their homes via the internet. Because this pretty much didn't work, a lot of these really big mergers just fell apart. I always loved this cartoon because there was such hoopla. There was such a big deal made of AOL and Time Warner getting together, but in reality, they never got along. AOL was kind of a new kid on the block and was very, very popular, and really kind of wanted to do things their way, whereas Time Warner was an established or basically a combination of established companies like Time Magazine and Warner Brothers Pictures and Studios. They had, Time Warner had its way of doing things, and AOL wanted to come in and change a lot of that. And there was just conflict from the very beginning, up until 2008, when this merger was basically ended. And it wasn't pretty when it did end. So again, the idea of allowing these two different technologies to come together because of what it would mean to competition really just didn't become reality. Then with respect to content, again, the idea was that by allowing the different technologies to meld, there would be more places for new ideas, new creative programming, and really kind of diverse programming. More minority groups would be able to become involved because there would be more access to it. So we'd have, really kind of a market of creativity. That really didn't happen either. What filled this new void that was created were basically old programs. Syndicated programs from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s were just recycled and put back on television. That meant that really kind of and really the formats of these programs of situation comedy and dramas and medical shows and lawyer shows, it was the same formulas. So there really wasn't new creative programming generated, diverse programming. And part of this also was because that even though there may have been more channels available, that didn't mean that minority groups were having access to these channels. Rather, again, large corporations were coming in, starting either starting channels or buying these channels. And so, again, they went with the programming that was going to make them money. They didn't really care about new ideas, but rather how can they generate revenue. So the idea that content was going to change never happened either. So for the most part, the things that were supposed to be revolutionary and bring a new horizon with the Telecommunications Act of 1996 just never really came to reality. There were some disturbing after effects of the 96 Act that began in different states around the country. In Wisconsin, it was known as the Video Competition Act in 2007. It was the lobbying by cable companies, but also just communication companies, particularly in the state of Wisconsin. It was AT&T that was pushing this, was that instead of having communication companies, cable companies, telephone companies negotiate with individual communities, what they wanted was to negotiate with each state, meaning centralizing the negotiations so that whatever sorts of deals were made were one-time deals. They didn't have to, so cable companies, communication companies didn't have to go and negotiate separate contracts in different communities. Rather, they did it once with the state, and that is, those are the conditions by which they then go into that state. It was passed in Wisconsin in 2007. Again, the idea or the argument by those who were in favor of this is that it's going to, again, generate competition. Now, instead of having just one service come to a state, several services can come to a state and negotiate for particular territories. So you're going to have more competition, but it's going to make it easier. They're going to be more willing to come to a place because they only have to negotiate with one one group. They only have to negotiate with the state. They don't have to negotiate with separate communities all around the state. But again, those who argued against this had some pretty compelling arguments. First, the money no longer goes to the communities who are going to be affected by these cable companies who are coming in. Rather, the money that they're paying, that these cable companies are paying, is going to the state. So even though a community is being told it will have this cable company coming in, they don't have any say in it, and they don't get any money related to the fees that that cable company is paying. The second problem is that if there is a violation of a contract by a cable company within a community, the community again has nothing to say about it. They can complain to the state, but then the state has to enforce any sort of penalties on that community or on that cable company, and that is very hard to do. Because the state is a separate entity, and they have a lot of other things to do. And worrying about a complaint by a small community in northern Wisconsin about a cable company not fulfilling what it's supposed to be doing, that's going to be low on the agenda. So consequently, the communities just have to live with what the cable company does until the state actually comes along and fixes the problem. It's also the fear that cable companies, instead of going to small towns in northern Wisconsin, are going to go to the more populated areas like Green Bay and Milwaukee and Madison, because that's where the people are. That's where the subscriptions are going to be. So even though Milwaukee may have 4 cable companies competing to be in that area, Hayward, Wisconsin may not have any. Consequently, they're not going to get any kind of cable service, simply because cable companies won't find it profitable to be in sparsely populated areas. And with this also came a reduction in cable companies' responsibility for covering local government with public access channels. It has been, in my own personal experience, I know the people over in the public access channel here in Eau Claire, and their budget was basically cut. They had to let people go and rely even more on volunteers, simply because they didn't have people to go and cover the Eau Claire City Council meetings and the Eau Claire County and Chippewa County County Board meetings. So it's what that meant is that the public didn't have access to their municipal governments via television technology, and that again is really counterintuitive to the rules that were established when cable really became its most popular. So the next PowerPoint will talk about a technology that is extremely important to the popularity of television and really the expansion of television into the omnipresent communication technology that it is, and that is videotape.